So, John Cattles, are you with us? Can we see you?
Here.
All right. Hey, John, how are you?
Good.
Thanks so much for doing this with us. And so everyone, this is what a lot of you have been kind of waiting for. This is where the rubber meets the road. A lot of these big ideas comes into a real plan where you live in a way that is at the, what is that statement from this morning? At the speed of trust. John, I don't know if you heard Ashley Pearl say that this morning, that these plans have to work at the speed of trust with the communities. And you've done a lot of work on that front and knowing your constituents really well, knowing your budgets really well, educating yourself on climate science, bang for the buck for this community reaching those goals. And so everyone, John is actually a Western alum. He was an art major here at Western when they had an emphasis in, what was it called, in building?
It was architecture, environmental design and architecture.
Yeah, and you recently earned a master's degree. You want to talk about that a little bit? Where was that? And what was
yeah, from CU Denver. I just recently completed a master's degree in public administration. So like an MBA for the public sector.
Yeah, a good fit for what you do. And everyone should know John is the Sustainable Operations Director for Gunnison County. And I was on the phone with Lauren Ahonen this morning, one of our MEM grads, and he just had a lot of kind things to say about you, John, just in that, were it not for your leadership and in believing in Western students, the solar array that's going to be at the airport coming up soon would be about 1/4 the size. And there wouldn't be a place to put it that's high profile. And your willingness to work with Western and collaborate with our students, I'm just so incredibly grateful what they're going to see from you today and beyond. You're a great alum. I hope we never ask you for money because you're giving everything. So with that, let's welcome John.
Thanks. And I'll transition just a little bit from what Aaron was saying. You won't see a climate action plan with Gunnison County either, actually. That's something that's real popular in a lot of government. They hire consultants and do a whole bunch of work, public outreach, come up with this plan. And we haven't done that. And I've resisted efforts to do that. And the reason is, I think, Aaron pointed out something that's really important about that. You need ownership. It needs to be yours, and you need to feel like you have agency in the outcomes. And so, what our strategy has been is to try to build that agency in the community as we do work. And so, because we don't have necessarily a formalized plan and some document, doesn't mean we don't have strategy and we're not planning. But our strategy and our planning is very intentional to try to bring along ourselves and our community and our elected leaders to understand what we have agency over and try to connect us more to the things that we need to have greater control and greater influence in. And so it's been a little bit of a like baby steps at first, but I strongly believe that you start slow so you can go fast later. We build a good foundation and then we can go make bigger steps later. And we've been doing that on our own in the county with internal actions. We took some baby steps early, and now we're starting to take some bigger, more bold steps toward addressing our own greenhouse gas emissions and energy use. And so that strategy is the same one we'll take as we work with the rest of our community and the municipalities in the county to develop actions that affect our community. And so it's kind of a little bit of, this is going to be a hard switch from a lot of the things people you've listened to today, and especially from Aaron, because I'm not a poet. I'm a technocrat at best. I really actually enjoy how organizations work. I really believe in government. I believe in democracy. And I really strongly believe that we have the tools it takes to make the change that we need to make, and with our governing structures, with our communities as they are. We just need to focus ourselves and our efforts and understand like a priority of actions. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of jump into a presentation here and just get you oriented with where Gunnison County is on our climate currently, our greenhouse gas emissions currently, and where it looks like we're going. And then we're going to break out into some smaller groups, and we're going to look at what actions and what might be possible in various sectors for change. And then we'll come back and we'll look at where that brings us holistically when we add all those together. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. I'm assuming everyone can see that now.
No, I don't see it yet, John.
You don't? Okay. How about now?
Yeah, it's looking better. Yep.
Okay. Okay. Let me set that up as a slideshow. There we go. So this is kind of just a start. This is a graph of carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere over the last 10,000 years. And the reason I start with this is because I want to add some context to why this is such an emergency. I think everyone in this room, in this Zoom room, I guess, is probably aware of this, but it's stark. We've never seen concentrations of carbon dioxide like this since humans have walked the earth. This is the last 10,000 years is the Holocene in geologic timeframes. The Holocene is what has been marked by a very stable climate. A lot of the periods before this were really unstable, and you see atmospheric CO2 very wildly, and with it global temperatures and mass extinctions of various species and ice ages and very hot periods. And so the Holocene is what we've been living in. That's where humans kind of came up into the earth before the Holocene, but this is where we've thrived, and we're seeing concentrations that have never existed. And so, you know, I'll ask a question that's hopefully meant to give you some thought. Like, so all the environmental justice and all these things around race and the intersection with environmental action, does it matter if we fail? If we can't control global warming, does any of that matter? And I'm not suggesting it's an either or, but what I am suggesting is that we have to succeed in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and even pulling back to more of a normalized greenhouse gas picture from the last 10,000 years, the Holocene. We're really, humans' impact on the environment is so great that some people actually have suggested that we should be adding another geologic timescale. And when I talk about geologic timescales, it's things like the Paleocene, you know, where dinosaurs roam the earth, and all these different scenes that most of us maybe heard once when we were in geology or something, but we don't really connect with. But we're in a period that some suggest should be called the Anthropocene. So anthropods or humans. We've made that big of an impact on our Earth that it will leave a record in the geologic timescale millions of years after humans are gone. And I think that when you think in those really long time scales, questions like John has asked, you know, what kind of a descendant do you want to be, really start to be, you could go out even further. What would whatever comes after humans think of humans when they see, you know, mountains hollowed out and an entire ecosystems wiped out, and our very weather systems changed, climate changed because of our impacts. So we just simply have to control this. So 2015 in Paris, the IPCC set these goals to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 C. And this is just to give context of what direction we need to go. And you can see on this graph, if we would have started back in 2000, you know, we would have had to make some drastic change, turn almost 180 from the direction we were going. But, you know, not nearly as steep as it is now. The year 2020 is this first blue line in the steep set of lines. And, you know, we need to very drastically drop our carbon emissions very, very quickly. This accounts to about to cutting our emissions from current 2020 emissions in half by 2030. That's what it's going to take. And then once we cut them in half, we have to continue on that trajectory all the way out to 2050 until we have near zero global emissions. So this is a huge task. And if we fail, the Earth's habitability will be greatly different than it is now. And all of these issues with, you know, the poor and the various races and other factors they'll all be exacerbated while people deal with these huge changes in our climate. So the question of, do we need to solve one before the other comes to my mind. I don't know, in my opinion, that we can wait to get a hold of all these other enormous problems in our world before we start taking drastic action on this. I think we have to do them both. Okay, so Gunnison County, our little piece of the pie of all those global emissions. This is what it looks like. This is our total footprint. Most of our energy is used in buildings, and most of the emissions comes from the generation of electricity. About a third of it is in our travel patterns. So the difference between this graph and this is that the first is our footprint. So it takes into account everything outside of the boundaries of this valley. So when we figure vehicle emissions, we also calculate in the emissions from refining the fuel for our vehicles. When we get to this level, we're really looking at direct impacts from our actions here, not those other direct ones. And so at the county level, as we track our progress, as we set goals, we use these in-boundary emissions because they're more reliable for us to continue to measure. It's a better measure, and the impacts of our policies should be felt more directly at this level. But if we make changes here, you're bound to see those changes reflected in our footprint. It's just a measuring technicality. So you can see buildings are a big the biggest part of our emissions, 61%. Transportation is 31%, and then landfill and our waste, it emits about 8% of the emissions in that area. We are obviously a residential area. We don't have a lot of industry, so industry doesn't even show up on here. And that's just a function of our place. In most places, these numbers are pretty much the same in other communities. We're not really unique in any way. I've seen these reports from Aspen and Eagle and even Denver, and they don't vary that much. This is where we're at as a country. We spend most of our energy conditioning our homes and the buildings that we go to school and work in, and then the second amount that's really large is our transportation habits. So this forecast is, when we first did this emissions inventory, when Dr. Chavez did this for us, it was in 2017, and we based it on a 2015 baseline. And so at that time, we just, Dr. Chavez forecasted out where we'll be in 2030, and we're on this upward trajectory. Wasn't good news. We've been making efforts to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by that time for almost 10 years, and we weren't making progress. This does account for our population growth, so that's where you see the most change as our population grows. There's more cars on the road, and the biggest change you see there is actually in surface travel, so cars on the road. We don't see a lot of change in our building energy use because while we're going to be building more buildings during this time period, the energy grid was getting slightly cleaner. There was promises at that point for cleaning up the grid, but they were very marginal changes. They were like going to gain 10% on their emissions over time. I updated this forecast early this year in 2020, and this is where we're going now. So we're actually starting to trend down finally, and the biggest change is the biggest change is in surface travel, our vehicles. And so the state of Colorado adopted some vehicle efficiency rules. They adopted the California standards, they're often called. And those rules just were a little stricter than the federal rules. And so when we put those into the model, we started to see surface travel, even though we're gaining cars, we're ultimately reducing the emissions associated with surface travel, even with that growth. And then the other thing that we modeled in is residential emissions will lower because we adopted a stricter energy code in our building code. And that actually accounts for about a 9% change in the efficiency of our buildings. So that was, significant. It's starting in the right direction, but nowhere near where we need to go to meet those IPCC goals, the 2030 and 2050 goals. So we're still not close to trending in the right direction, and I was feeling like my hands were tied because most of the emissions were coming from a sector that we had no influence and no regulatory control over. It was the electric sector. We had very little influence and control over surface transportation. The county, along with the RTA, has some influence over the bus service in the county, in the valley. But we'll talk a little bit later about that impact. That impact just wasn't big enough to make a measurable change in the surface transportation emissions. So this is just getting in a little bit deeper into the buildings. Most of our emissions are coming from buildings, and most of it's coming from homes. But what's interesting to me is if you look at I have the conditioned space, and those are big numbers, but commercial space, even though it's approximately a quarter, maybe a little greater than a quarter of the actual space that residential space is, it still takes 43% of the emissions are associated with it. So commercial buildings were really, really inefficient. So that's a problem and an opportunity for us to make some big change. This is how, when we break down where the emissions from buildings are coming from, this graph juxtaposes energy and emissions. So the bars are energy and the background is emissions. And the reason I put this in is because there's been a big debate about natural gas in this country, and natural gas is the yellow. And as you can see, natural gas has an inverse relationship to its emissions as electricity does today. So natural gas produces, a large portion of our energy, but it's a smaller portion of the emissions in the valley. And electricity is the opposite. Electricity right now produces about a quarter of the energy that we're using, but it's more than half the emissions. So electricity is really dirty. And as we're talking about electrification and electric cars and all these future things, we're still confronted with this reality we have today. And not at the time we did this forecasting, there wasn't a lot of change in the electric sector. We weren't seeing them make promises that this was going to change. So it really created a conundrum in policy, which direction we should go. Natural gas was far cleaner for the amount of energy we got from it, but we knew that that would only get us so far. We weren't going to make a 50% cut in our emissions and while we stuck with natural gas. But at this time, natural gas was probably the better choice. So it created a dilemma and a real frustration, since we don't have a lot of control over the electric utilities. So I'm going to shift into talking about building efficiency. We use a term that's called energy use intensity, and it's just a way of normalizing the use of energy across different kinds and different sizes of buildings. So it's just BTUs per square foot per year. So it lets you compare a big building to a small building, a new building to an old building. What we found when we started looking at an EUI in our area is that the average home in Gunnison has an EUI of 51. And we looked around at data that was available for the same climate zone we have. So very cold, climate zone 7. Most of those are in Minnesota and Alaska, but they all have the same energy demand as we have. They have the same climate. And what we found was that most homes are much more efficient. The average in climate zone 7 is 42 and we're 51. So we're not in good shape. We're much dirtier than or much less efficient than the average home in the country. And then we looked at what an energy code compliant home would be. So just barely squeaking by, making code, your home will have an EUI of about 35. So really big differences from where we are today on average to what's possible with the national cold climate zone somewhere in the middle of those. And so this is why energy code is a big deal. It creates a far more efficient home. And when we look at growth and rebuild of homes, we estimate that by 2030, 17% of the homes in the county will have been built under this energy code or a better one that we adopt as we go. And then just for context of what's possible, this home, it's in Gunnison in the Van Tile neighborhood, has an EUI of 4. You can get very, very efficient if you try. And this is not an expensive home. It's certainly a little more expensive than a starter home. But, you know, this is a young couple that built this home. They're not rich retirees or anything like that. This is achievable. So as you can see here, this goes back to talking about what the energy sources are and where the emissions are in these buildings. And so Tri-State is where we get our energy in everything outside of the city of Gunnison, and inside the city of Gunnison, they have their own utility. But you can see that electricity emits far more energy than natural gas and propane, or far more emissions for the same amount of energy. So the blue bar is energy, and the orange bar is emissions. And so there's a disconnect there with those fuels at this point. Sorry for jumping around there. I think that slide was out of order. This slide is talking about commercial buildings again. As we pointed out, commercial buildings in this area are really, really inefficient. The average commercial building has an AUI of 140. And the commercial average in the country is 86. So we're in bad shape. An energy code compliant building has an EUI of 61. So it's like multiples less energy needed in an energy code compliant building than in the average building in Gunnison. And then what's possible, these are 2 buildings that the county owns that we've put a lot of work into trying to make efficient. So our human services building, we have an EUI of 31, and the courthouse has an EUI of 33. And these were before we put solar arrays on these 2 buildings. So those numbers should drop significantly as we update our data. But it's possible to do even better, you know, cut your energy use in half from even energy code. And we did these while not spending a lot more money than your average building. In fact, at the time we built the courthouse, it was per square foot one of the most efficient, cost-effective buildings in the valley. We built it for less money per square foot than I'll pick on Western. Then Western was building some of their new halls, and so we can do this. We can get very efficient without having to spend a fortune to do so. This building, this human services building, was built in 1952, and before we started, we had an EUI of in the 90s, and then we did a renovation and got it down to 31, and we did that again without spending millions of dollars to do so. We had a renovation to do and needed to replace some equipment, and we paid a pretty marginal price in getting that equipment replaced over what like the lowest cost would be, and we were able to still achieve really good efficiency. So this is the direction those 2 buildings have gone over the last several years. And this is, when I started, I was talking about baby steps. We took baby steps at first. In 2009, this was our energy use. The red is natural gas. The blue is electricity. And when I started in this position, we started taking action to reduce our energy in our buildings, and we made some efficiency improvements, and we benchmarked those in 2013, and we made significant change. We cut our energy by about 30% in both of these buildings, about 20% in the courthouse, 30% in the other building. Then when we started electrifying our buildings, despite the fact that electricity is dirty here, we went ahead and did it because we knew that was the future, and we're hoping that the utilities come along and change. And so we went ahead and electrified our buildings, and This is our gross energy use in the courthouse after we added a geothermal system to it. Here's our emissions. So you can see our emissions did not drop nearly as much as our energy use because we used electricity. We did still get a drop though. I just put photovoltaics on the roof of these buildings, and so this is a forecast because I haven't had time to collect the data, but we expect to cut our energy use again in half, and now we're finally starting to see that emissions are trending down the way we want as well, because we're replacing that dirty electricity with self-generated electricity. So this is massive change from where we were. We went from using 1.5 million BTUs per square foot to 200,000 BTUs per square foot in our buildings. So in this one building. So it's an incredible change, and we had to build trust though by succeeding on these small steps before we could take a big step and take some risk and spend money to take a really large step. We needed to build our own expertise. We needed to take control and agency into our decisions and understand that we could make the right decisions and control this. And then we were able to get really aggressive. Shifting to transportation. Surface transportation is about 29% of greenhouse gas emissions in the county. And that's significant. And a lot of times, I created these graphs for a conference we had this winter in January, and we were speaking to our constituents, the locals, and you all are locals as well, students here. But a lot of what we hear from locals is the traffic problem is tourists. It's not us. And so I wanted to kind of dig into that a little bit and understand if that was true. And so we knew that our shoulder seasons were really slow in Gunnison at the time. They're not slow this year, but most years, April and May, you can hardly find a restaurant to eat at in Crested Butte because everybody's closed and on vacation. And the same in October and November. Yet here's the vehicle counts along that year in Gunnison on Highway 135 going to Crested Butte. We see a little dip, but there's not a big dip. That dip probably accounts for tourists that aren't here. And this rise accounts for tourists that are. But the vast majority of traffic on that road is us going up and down that road. It's people that are here all year round. But what came to light as we started looking at this data, we started looking at the growth. This is 3 years. This is 2018 and 2015. And we started seeing that there's a lot of growth in traffic. And that growth is 18%. There's 18% more cars on the road than there was in 2015. But our population only grew by 4%. So we're driving more. So we wanted to kind of understand why, and I'll get into that a little bit next here. Oh, that's our local commuters. You can see those lines go across. Those are consistent lines year round of traffic volume. Whoops. We think, we have a theory anyway, of why we're seeing more traffic, more driving than population growth. And that theory is that people are having to live farther away from their work. During the same period of time, 2015 to 2018, the housing crisis in this valley got a lot worse. There's been a housing crisis in this valley since I went to school at Western. We used to have to fight for rentals just like you do now. And that was a while ago. And so it's nothing new, but it's getting worse. And what we're seeing is the change in the North and South Valley is exacerbating. So where there's always was a housing crisis, if you wanted to live in Crested Butte and you were patient, you used to be able to find a place to live in Crested Butte that you could afford. And that's getting harder and harder to do. So you might have to live in Gunnison, but you may still be driving to Crested Butte to work. And then even if you're living in Gunnison, there's no rentals available. There's virtually no vacancy. And so people are moving farther and farther out of town into these homes that are available, 4 or 5 miles away from town, and then having to commute to school or work. So on transportation, what does our bus service do? We have a really successful bus service for our population. Our RTA has moved 250,000 people in 2019, one way up the valley. So that's significant. If we account for the average amount of people in a car, it's like 2.2%, something like that. They displaced 141,000 cars off the road. That's an average of 387 cars per day that aren't on Highway 135. So it's a big thing, and it's very significant. But how much does it really impact when we look at these numbers? 4,000 cars a day is kind of that average that's on that road.
Yeah, John, and it seems like you greatly increased your bus routes, your free bus routes, from like 13 to 25 over the years that transportation and cars is going up.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. We're increasing buses and we're still seeing more cars on the road. So yeah, so we have a problem that isn't necessarily a transportation problem. And I think that's something that we can talk about when we get into our breakout groups. What's driving that? So the last sector is landfill. And so everybody seems to be very interested in landfill emissions. We hear a lot about composting and recycling, and the county gets probably more pressure from the public to do something about compost and create a compost facility than we do anything else. I got almost 0 phone calls about solar arrays, but we get contacted weekly about the landfill. And it's interesting to us. People are very engaged with that. But the emissions are 8% of our total emissions. This is, I don't want to minimize it too much, but when we're looking at global climate change and cutting our emissions in half, this is a pretty small piece of the pie. But that said, we still have a waste problem. Each one of us adds about almost 4 cubic yards of waste to the landfill every year. So that's significant. And the single largest part of our landfill mix is organics. So there's an opportunity there to pull those organics out of the landfill and do something with them. So I know this is kind of boring. Hang in there with me for a little bit longer, and then we'll get into more interesting. But I just need to give the context for you all. So electric utilities. Talked a lot about utilities and how dirty they are. This is the benchmarking for where our utilities are. So the city of Gunnison, this is a mouthful of a number, but if you're going to get into understanding greenhouse gas emissions, you need to understand these numbers. This is called an emissions factor. And an emissions factor is measured in pounds or kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. So the city of Gunnison, that's their emission factor. GCA claims that theirs is right here at 5.4. In 2015, when Dr. Chavez measured it and did a bunch of research to understand where it was, he came up with a number that was 30% higher than that. So that's curious. I'm hoping that since Dr. Chavez did his work that they cleaned up 30%, but that would be a lot of change in a very short time. So here's where we are. This is the direction we're traveling today. And our challenge is to cut this in half by 2030. And so I'll introduce some breakout groups and give some instruction. But before we do, I want to add just a little bit of hope to this situation. And so this is where we are trending if we can get current policies to stick. And what I mean by that is the state of Colorado has set goals of 80% reduction from our electric emissions sector by 2030. That's a really ambitious goal. And they're doing everything they can to regulate that. But they're having to wrest control, regulatory control over industries that haven't had them before, in ways they haven't had before. But if they're successful with doing nothing else, we'll be looking at a 30% reduction in our emissions in this area. So there's hope. And there's also hope that by our electricity being cleaner, we can start making other actions in our building sector and start to reverse that trend of natural gas being a better short-term choice than electricity. And so this is really positive change. And the county does a lot of work to try to support the state. We lobby the state and the Public Utilities Commission to enforce their rules. We've intervened in PUC cases to express our citizens' will where things should go, and also our concern about the governance structure of our utilities, which is very wonky, but it's a really important piece of wresting that control over those utilities. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here if I can figure out how. Okay, I'm back. So thanks for hanging in there for that overview of where we're at. But it's important to understand kind of the context of what we're facing, so that when we make plans, we're making plans that are based in our current reality. Sorry, I'm gonna switch some screens here and I can't seem to speak and do that at once, so forgive me. So we're gonna break into some breakout groups. We're gonna break into a group on utilities. So that's gonna be generally electric utilities, but if you wanna talk about natural gas utilities, that's fine. There's gonna be a group on buildings and efficiency. There'll be a transportation group, and there'll be a waste group. And I would like, and you're going to get randomly put into these groups. And so you might not feel comfortable with the group you're in, but try to engage in that. I think it'll be interesting to get folks mixed up a little bit from where maybe your comfort level is. As you're talking about these sectors, the goal is ultimately to come up with a percentage reduction goal. And don't just say 100%. It's a temptation, but my hope is to try to get you to start thinking about how things work in local government. And local government's a good, it'll help you give you an understanding of state and federal government as well, and how things work and what levers we have to make change, what our regulatory authority is. I'm gonna pose some things to you before we break. I've heard a lot recently about revolution, and we need to change, just totally turn upside down our energy use, our capitalist society, our wasteful consumerism. And I believe that there does need to be revolution, but I would almost frame it as revival over revolution in some ways. So capitalism has always had a bent toward greed and monopoly. That's how capitalism works. People are incentivized to make money, and then once they've gained a market share and a way to have a consistent income flow, they're incentivized to protect that. And the way they protect that is by growing larger and larger and eating up their competitors and influencing anyone who could regulate them. I think, in my opinion, what's wrong with where we're at now is that the government has become weaker than the corporation, and we have stopped regulating. We've stopped gaining control to make sure that it's a fair playing field for everybody out there in a capitalist economy. Why is that important for our energy use? Because I believe that the capitalist economy is probably the best tool we have to make really big change if we can harness it. It's like having a wild horse that's powerful and just all over the place, just uncontrollable, breaking fences, hurting people that try to engage with it, and then taking that horse and being able to break it. And that sounds like a really harsh word. And I'm a country boy. I grew up in a small town, and when I hear that word, I don't hear like this harshness of like breaking it, like you ride it till it subdues or submits to your will. There's a relationship you build with an animal like that, and they willingly allow you to control them. If we can gain and wrest control of our economy, it's like putting a bit in the mouth of a powerful horse, and we can direct it in directions that are helpful for our economy. And so on a local level, there's things that I think we can do that will start to direct our economy in directions that are positive for our environment. So when you're talking about your sector, be thinking about that, and also keep in mind what kind of government you want to live under. Don't there's a temptation often to fantasize that, well, we should just, I hear this all the time from people that reach out to me. The government should just mandate that everybody builds X way, straw bales or whatever. You need to think about, would you want to live with a government that has that much power and then takes an action that maybe you wouldn't like? And so, we need to keep in context like the type of government that we would like to live under and the economy that we live with. And there's a lot of tools that we have that can take those two things and direct our economy toward a lot cleaner future. I'm going to give one example here, and I'm going to share my screen one more time just to kind of give you guys some context. You guys see that? This is a web page from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab. NREL is doing this study. It's called the SEAM study. And all this study is looking at is our grid. Spanning down this map of the United States at the bottom. This is our current grid. Our grid is cut into east, west, and of course, Texas. Texas has their own grid. They're kind of their own country. There's only 6 places that power crosses from east to west in our country. And they crosses in very small amounts. So this really smart researcher at NREL he put together a model, and he can show every generation plant in the United States, and then he can show solar and wind potential across the United States. And what he started doing was fantasizing about having no limit to interconnection east and west. And what he found was that if you do that, you will put coal out of business just through pure market economics in 5 to 10 years. You'll make it so expensive to run coal relative to renewables that without any further regulation, they'll bankrupt. This guy who originally ran this study got run out. I'm going to put this link in the chat box, but there's an article in the Atlantic. How a plan to save the power system disappeared. Once this original SEAM study caught wind in the halls of power, it got squashed because what he was proposing was a very modest government investment into connecting our grid that unleashed capitalist forces that would take the country in a direction that the current administration didn't want. So
Is that breaking the horse, John, right there?
yeah, they understand how to run that capitalist economy. They put a bit in the horse and they directed it the way they wanted. We need to be just as smart and use those same tools against the industry right now that's taking advantage of those tools. And you're seeing that already. Give me one moment here. I'm gonna stop sharing. So there's a link for that out there. I would propose that the reason we're seeing our utilities finally start changing their direction and saying they want to go to greener sources of energy isn't because people protested. It isn't because of all these efforts that I've been a part of. We had efforts to change tri-state for decades, and we did so through lobbying and public pressure and showing plans. But a year before they announced a plan to reduce their emissions and close most of their coal-fired power plants by 2030. A year before that announcement, they got downgraded by Moody's. Their credit rating was downgraded by Moody's. And Moody's cited their cost of fuel as the reason for downgrading Tri-State's credit rating. They saw the capitalist winds changing. If they don't have access to cheap credit, they don't have a future. So all of our effort, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but ultimately what turned them was economic capitalist forces. What got to that point was the fact that solar and wind continues to drop in price. And so there's a lot of government policy that went into supporting solar and wind. We put a lot of money into research. NREL is a great example. That lab gets a tiny fraction of what we spend on military research. But they've been able to drop the price of solar panels precipitously for decades, and it continues to drop. They've been able to drop the price to generate wind for decades. And other countries are taking that research and those findings and benefiting it more than our own country is. So that's my proposal, that we need a revival. We need to understand where we came from. Our founders understood that capitalism was a powerful force that needed to be contained and directed. And we've lost that containment and direction, in my opinion. And so in government, work with the tools we have. And the tools we have are some modest regulation and a pulpit. So we can talk to the public, we can institute regulation, and we can get some, we can affect change that way. And I think that there are some tools we have to regulate that might be helpful in changing each one of those sectors that we've spoken about. So we're gonna break now into our—
And John?
Yes, John.
I want to say a couple quick things and thanks about this talk, Dave. You know, I appreciate a couple challenges you brought to the audience. You know, one being that, yes, let's think about inclusion and anti-racism, but understand that those issues, as well as issues like healthcare, COVID, all these issues that also are affected by race, all live inside climate change. And climate change exacerbates all those issues. I appreciate that challenge a lot. And then getting us to think about revival instead of revolution with that example of just sort of turning the grid in a certain direction as that breaking the horse of capitalism, getting it to work for your values. And then thirdly, just how data driven you were. You know, you really kind of walk the talk with data that's right where we live. And the possibilities you show are concrete possibilities, right? Not just some cool greenhouse up on the hill of some rich second homeowner, but the possibilities you showed and how to scale those up are real and data driven. And we're all learning to appreciate that in an era in which the CDC is being ignored and data is being ignored. So just thank you for this talk. I think that the conference needed it.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah. And I hope that, you know, I hope that the opportunity to engage a little bit with this data will make it real for everyone. And I also, I'm going to encourage everyone to get engaged in your local politics. You guys live here. I assume most of you do. Maybe some of you are online students somewhere else, but you know, you'd be surprised how few people actually engage and show up at meetings and talk to their elected leaders. We need to hear from you. It matters.
And it's amazing how loud one voice can carry, how far one voice can carry in a meeting, right?
It is. Yeah. And usually that voice is not the voice we want to hear from. And people in my boat, we struggle all the time with context, right? So we get yelled at and we have to contextualize. That's probably a minority, but it can sometimes be a challenge. So we're going to break into these groups. As we break into these groups, you're going to talk about what's driving emissions in these different sectors amongst yourselves, in your opinion, and talk about what you think is possible for change in the next 10 years. This is 10 years is a really pretty short time period. And so try to think realistically. Like I said, try to think about if your idea is regulation based, try to think about what kind of a government you'd want to live in if that power was used in a different way. Try to think about what's realistic cost wise. Can't just tax our way out of this. And let's get creative. And then we're going to go through each one of those when we come back together, and we're going to see where it takes us holistically. We're going to put those all into our greenhouse, our model, and we'll populate that model, and we'll see where we're tracking for 2030. And just as kind of a preview, I'll tell you that when we did this with our public meeting we held in January, the result was we got past 50%. We found a path that got us to less than 50% of our emissions today in 2030. And we did that with the public, with people who are our constituents, saying these are things we'd be okay with. And we had a fairly good amount of people in this room taking part in this exercise. So I'm interested to see what you all come up with. I'm sure you're going to come up with vastly different ideas than everyone else. So with that, I think we're ready to break. Welcome back.
That was fun.
Good. It was probably not enough time. I'm guessing it's a lot.
Well, with 3 seconds left, Tristan volunteered to be our presenter. So right down to the wire.
Right. That's good. These are all really complex. Every one of these sectors is complex, and it has a lot of things, a lot of consequences to action that may or may not fit our values, right? So every time we talk about one of these, you can start going down a rabbit hole, especially when we start talking about equity and racism, like the theme of this. This is you could really easily get sidetracked. So I'm sure that wasn't enough time, but hopefully it was enough to get you engaged a little bit. And we're going to start going through these, and we'll talk more as we go through each one of these. I'll try to move quickly.
And John, quick question: when and how do we end up quantifying our ideas in terms of, getting toward 50% or?
We're going to do that now.
Oh, cool. All right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're
You gotta be
great.
curious. Okay.
So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen, and sorry, I don't talk and do things at the same time very well. Okay, there, shared my screen. And we're just going to go through these, and we're going to look at a forecast. And then as we go through these, I want to talk about some of the discussion you had, and have some opportunity for some discussion about quantifying goals and maybe challenges and opportunities or co-benefits that we might see by taking action on some of these goals. So I'm going to start with electric utilities. I know that was a hard one. I was in that group, and it was James did a good job leading it, but it's a hard subject because we don't know a lot about our electric utilities. I think though that's the problem, right? We don't know very much about our utilities, and yet they're the biggest driver of climate change. So maybe we need to fix that. So James, do you want to go ahead and maybe talk about a couple issues that came up in the discussion, and then we'll go to the goals that group set.
Yeah. So as John's saying, when it comes to utility and just electric use in general, while a lot of people want the grid to be clean, there's a big gap in actually understanding where your energy comes from, and simple stuff as like, do you have gas or electric heat at your house? Question that most people my age can't answer. And so one of the big things we hit on was just education. Education around things such as GCEA is a cooperative. So we all are part of that cooperative, and we get at least residents of the county in Crested Butte get a say and can affect those changes. If they know that is not so certain, as people tend to not really know the difference between rural, cooperative, investor-owned. It gets quite complex. So one of the things was just talking about education, and doing a lot more community outreach and education around what is possible, for local action to be taken to influence, to apply pressure to these utilities. For the city of Gunnison, that is electing county officials that can influence the city utility. For GCEA, that is voting people in or putting you're paying in to be a part of this company. So using that voice to help create change. Now, while the PUC does have regulation over tri-state, and that is going to completely change their portfolio from very, very, I think it's almost 100%, 98% coal electricity generation. They're going to have to meet the 2030 standards of 90% carbon reduction in facilities within Colorado and 70% reduction in their wholesale market that they're selling to communities within Colorado. So At the county level, although we still need to work and, use our voices, the GCEA does now have oversight and will be having to meet these 2030 reduction goals. But at the county side, we still need to work to or not county, city side, we just still need to work to further putting people in position within the next 10 years that are willing to take on this energy utility issue that is quite complex. It's not a simple issue for someone to take on. I believe another part that we didn't really quite talk about too much, but just that residential, it's an inverse of most major cities where commercial buildings have the most energy use. So there is a big gap for residents to build out solar rooftop infrastructure, as well as, I know the infrastructure group will probably talk about this, improved building energy efficiency at the residential level. And then finally, something to take into account is the rural efficiency gap, which is just the barriers that high altitude rural communities face to implementing these kinds of projects, whether it comes down to cost of transportation, having a big enough workforce, housing for a workforce, and all that kind of stuff. So we kind of came up, and John's being realistic of it. I mean, for GCEA, it'll be hard to say, but for the county-wide, we can assume roughly a 70% reduction based off of the regulations they have to meet. And then across the city, right now the city does get about 40% of its electricity from hydro. It's only about 48% from coal. And so we're going to say that reduction is about, I think 60%. I'm not sure if I'm doing those numbers correctly, but 60% of electricity from the city to be renewable is kind of what I think an achievable goal in the next 10 years could be.
Okay. So you guys are kind of, you're pessimists. You don't think they'll even make the state goals of 80%?
I just, I just, especially with the administration changes or whatever happens in this year, I think it's it could go either way. It could be a lot abrupter or it could be a lot better. I tend to play the downside, I think.
Okay. So just for some context, if we reduce the energy or the emissions factor by 70% for GCA, I kind of have this cheat sheet down here. It says estimated EF based on percentage of renewables. We're going to be at about a 70% full renewables. So it's kind of, they relate to each other. It's not perfectly tracking. Like if you have 70% reduction, you're 70% renewables, but it's fairly close. That's a huge change from where we are now. And just a quick discussion about what that means. So Tri-State has announced they've already closed the coal plant in Nucla, and that town is already struggling. They'd already seen some mines close, and now that town is really economically gutted. And there's some efforts to revitalize it as a destination and some arts, but there's a bigger impact going to happen right now in Craig, Colorado. Craig has a really large electric generation. It's owned by, most of the generation is owned by Tri-State, and they even own the mine that's there. And they've announced closing generation before 2030. The dates have been changing a little bit here and there, but I've heard dates as early as 2025 for part of that generation. And by 2030, that will be gone, along with the thousands of jobs with it. So as we talk about just transition, I think that's a conversation that is very real in these communities. And it's something we need to see, these big reductions, but there's a consequence. There are towns literally built around electric generation. There are towns literally built around coal mines, and those places are going to suffer. So that's just to give some context, but with these goals plugged in here, we're tracking overall at about 25% reduction from today.
So I'm curious if James's group shares your more optimistic view or James's more pessimistic view. Do the workers want to take over the factory in James's group there? Sorry, James, but it looks like you're
that's fine. No, I didn't. Oh no, I just yeah. I mean, I just tend to play on the conservative side with just not fully. It's just with these plans. I think John made a really good point. Is even with climate action plans, like things look great on paper, but how do we execute and like what's being done on the ground? Crested Butte finished up their climate action plan, and on a side note, I'm doing a little bit of outreach and stuff for them on that. But boots on the ground after these plans are done doesn't always translate into benchmarkable and measurable differences. So
well put.
Yeah, and I would like to give a shout out. I don't think he's here, but Garrett McDaniel, his master's project, I believe it was his doing. But SEI, Solar Energy International, is working with Colorado Energy Office on helping just transition these coal communities to rural electricity providers. They just announced it, I think, last week. But definitely something to watch out for and understand those impacts. Similarly to coal mines going bankrupt, they're mainly funded by municipal bonds, which are retirement funds and 401ks and XYZ that we necessarily don't want them going bankrupt. So how do we transition justly to this new energy is going to be, I think, a little bit harder than people.
It's an incredibly important subject, and not just because it's fair. Like that is enough, right? It's fair to treat other people well and try to make sure that their economic future is being planned for, even though there'll be some hardship. But there's a reality too. There's a political reality to it, and one thing is that I'd like to point out is both the utilities that we're talking about are in some way democratically controlled. The city of Gunnison owns their own utility. Every 2 years, the city of Gunnison elects its council, or 3 to 4 members of it. You guys, everyone that lives in this town has a voice in electing people that will take this seriously and take action. If you pay a bill to GCA, you're a member of a co-op, so you have a democratic voice. And I think that's something that the county has been picking on Tri-State and GCA a little bit, that their democratic values are weak. But that's something that they're proud of. They're proud that they're a co-op. They're proud of democratic values. And so we ought to hold them to it. You guys have a vote, and you can vote for change, but at the same time, coming back around to this just transition, we don't want whiplash, right? So we don't want to bankrupt a whole bunch of people and have their families and just starving or in poverty, and then they go vote the bastards out that we voted in, right? a just transition ensures that transition will be durable. And so I posed the question early of, do we need to focus on equity and racism and all of these seemingly ancillary issues? Or do we just need to focus on climate change and reducing emissions? And I think the fact that we live in a democracy means we have to focus on all of them. You can't win on one without winning, or at least having some benefit for everyone. A transition that's durable and will last generations is gonna have to be a just transition, a transition that makes for a better future for everyone. So yeah, electric generation is incredibly complex, and we don't have to know everything about it. We just need to use the voice we have. Most of the time, the people elected to the board of GCA run unopposed. That's why we complain a little bit that their democratic values, their democratic process is broken a bit. They don't have a robust democracy where there's a debate and where people are expressing their will. People are disengaged, and that's their fault. But there's also not a lot of effort, in my view, to engage members and make sure that you're educated and informed on what the utility is doing. Same goes for the city.
We had a student run for city council, environment sustainability major, I don't know, 8-9 years ago. And I think it was an off year. It wasn't a presidential year. So there was low student turnout, and he only lost by 73 votes. If it was a high student turnout year, he would have won as an undergrad.
That's amazing. And that's
Lauren. That was Lauren. And yeah, we now have Diego Plata, as Kate points out, and a former MEMer on city council. So all you listening, this is within your reach, the kind of level that John's talking about.
So I'm going to, we'll leave these goals here, but I think we might revisit these, because I think we have more agency in electric utilities than we might think. And even outside of our valley, if you're in a place where you get your energy from a corporation like XL, they're still influenced by customers and customer behavior. XL has been really pushed by corporate behavior. So they get corporations that are buying huge amounts of power from them that say, I don't want dirty power. I want to be able to tell my customers that I make this thing, whatever we make, in a way that's clean and socially responsible and environmentally responsible. And so they've been reacting to that pressure. And then all utilities are controlled, well, except for the very small ones, are regulated by our Public Utilities Commission. And that commission is appointed by our governor. So the governor we vote for has a huge impact in Colorado on what happens in regulation. And so the election of Hickenlooper, he got to appoint 2 commissioners to the PUC. And when our current governor, Polis, was elected, he got to nominate 1 more. And now we have a Public Utilities Commission that is very progressive. They're very experienced, and they're moving utilities in the right direction. So all that to say, vote, get engaged, take agency in where your energy comes from. It's very, very important, and not enough of us understand it. Building efficiency. Who's speaking for building efficiency?
I'll say a few words, and then Tristan's going to take over. The form you provided based on the PowerPoint was really helpful. And you said that Gunnison's average residential EUI is 51, and the energy code from 2012 is 35. And then commercially, Ours is 140 and the energy code 61. But you showed affordable possibilities at 4 for residents and at 31 for health and human services. And so the hardest part of the conversation was equity. We think that what you presented us with merges environment and economy really well in terms of the 3 E's of the triple bottom line, but equity's the hardest one. So John, you posed a question to us, could you have low EUI branded, like labeled in realty, so it's like granite countertops, and so we had that kind of conversation, whether or not that was successful in terms of equity. We certainly thought homeowners would save money, businesses would save money on energy, and therefore healthier environment. But in terms of equitable access to those ecological and economic benefits is a whole nother question. So Tristan, I'll let you go from there, and then I'll offer some numbers from our conversation.
Yeah, okay, so we talked about a lot of different things, but basically we addressed how Gunnison has a 25% poverty rate versus a 13% poverty rate nationwide. And so a little bit with like listing the EUI as something on like the housing market, we agreed that it would help to make a healthier living environment, but we also thought that it might make it to where landlords are more easily able to up prices on rent, and so it would be less available to people with lower incomes. And we also touched a little bit on how undocumented citizens don't have the same type of voice in these type of problems as other citizens. We also talked a little bit about policy changes and like incentivizing solar in Gunnison, which led us to talk about equitable solar solutions. And what they're doing in the community is they're taking refurbished solar panels and putting them on low income housing, housing in need. And then the savings that they get that would have gone into energy are then funneled back into the community.
It's an awesome program.
Yeah, and I'm gonna.
It was kind of cool because 3 of the people in the group have been involved in equitable solar solutions, and then 2 of them did a tour of your building, John, the courthouse, and so it was a pretty wise group when it came to this question. And John, the 2012 Energy Code, it says blended average. Is this the Gunnison County Energy Code?
Yes. Yeah. That is the code that the county and actually all of the municipalities we all at once adopted the same code for once. So yeah.
Yeah, and so we thought by 20, just from listening to my group, we didn't get into the numbers, and my group can disagree with this, but based on our conversation, my thinking is that, by 2030, given that, and I know Hedda, one of our students, and I know John, given that they're at 4, we think that my sense from the conversation is the energy code could be exceeded. And that's where that policy change would come from, that the group was talking about. And they were calling for policy change so that the landlords kind of have to do it, which would make the savings more equitable. And so I don't know, could that even be in the upper 20s? And then the commercial one, could that even be at like 50, given what you're able to do with the courthouse so affordably, and then have it met by 2030?
Yeah, those are achievable. They're very aggressive goals because you're dealing with both old and new, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and what do you do? Like you can do everything new really, really efficient, but what do you do with what exists? And so John mentioned or maybe it was Tristan mentioned benchmarking. So you basically, what you do is you say, look, if you want to rent a house or sell a house, you have to disclose the energy use of the home. But more than that, you have to kind of disclose its ranking or a score. There's been an effort for a long time at the federal level and the state level to adopt a building energy score. It's just boiling down all these variables to a number 1 to 10. In some cases, it's like 0 to 100, but boiling it down to a score. So if you're looking at 2 rentals and one is a 4 and one of them's a 8, you go, wow, I'd rather pay bills in the one that's an 8 than the one that's a 4. And the idea being it incentivizes landlords to compete with each other and make sure that, you know, they're getting renters they want. If they are struggling to rent their space because it's inefficient, maybe they'll invest in their space. The problem that we see is that there's virtually no vacancy in rentals. So there's already a non-functioning competitive market. I think it's clear, I keep talking about capitalism, but you know, that's not a good thing. Like that's not a functioning capital market. Realtors and people in the industry would tell you that you want to see a vacancy rate of 4 to 7% to have a healthy rental market where there's homes available for people that need them, and there's price competition and there's quality competition. Landlords are keeping
Well, and this is where inclusion came into the conversation again, because as you point out in the document, Gunnison's poverty rate's at 25% compared to a national average of 13%. It's a landlord's market, if you will. So renters don't have a lot of leverage, and they have a poverty of choice as well as economic poverty. Then you add into that the component of undocumented residents who have, you know, for reasons of American xenophobia and white supremacist policies, a fear of speaking out, right? And so having a policy like the one you discussed would really help people who don't feel safe, you know, shopping around or doing bids with different landlords or challenging or haggling or complaining publicly about living conditions or energy bill.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you could do the same kind of scoring for selling homes too, right? You could just say, you can't list a home for sale unless you include this information in the listing. So those are things actually that we as a government have the power to do. And I would argue there's very little downside. I don't see how that is taking power or executing our power in a way that, as I said, if the tables were turned, would you like to live under that type of a government? We're simply saying, give information. We're not saying what to do. We're just saying, make the information public so that people can make a choice. So those are really pretty passive government actions on the scale of action you take.
Anything else any of my group members want to share? Thank you, Tristan. Anything he and I left out that you thought important?
I guess one more thing that we touched on briefly towards the end of our breakout session was the need to build, especially commercial buildings, for from the perspective of the building's lifetime. So like to last 100+ years instead of in the terms of like short-term profit and now.
That's an awesome point. So that's been the most powerful tool that we've had at the county, is decoupling the payback period from a business type of a mindset to a building life cycle type of a mindset. So and so as government, we have a different perspective than business, but I'll give government's perspective, and then we can talk a little bit about business. But when I first started at the county, even myself, I had this idea that anything we did really needed to have a payback of 8 to 10 years. So if we invested in efficiency measures, the savings that those netted should pay back that investment within 8 to 10 years. And that would even be in the long range in a business. Businesses, the world moves fast and economies move fast, so they need to see return on their investments in short periods of time. A business would love to see ROIs in the 3 to 5 years, but some businesses can get out into the 8 to 10 year range. But once we started to realize that our buildings were going to be here for a long time, and it's really happened when we built this courthouse. There's been a courthouse on the site since 1881, and we were building a new one on the same site. And me and the county manager, Matthew Burney, started having a discussion about the value of efficiency and what we should invest in. And all of a sudden, both of us kind of went, we're building a quality building. It'll as a life cycle, it'll need some work over the years, but this will be here in 100 years, just like the other one was. And so we started to change our thinking about efficiency to a life cycle mindset. And so that was really what helped us get over the hump, with our thinking to go to geothermal. We knew geothermal was going to be good. We knew it would be efficient, but it was a big upfront cost. But when we realized that it's not if it's going to pay back and save the county money, it's when it's going to start paying back and saving the county money. That helped us get over that hump. And businesses, I think, have the opportunity to do the same. If a business isn't in a building, it doesn't mean that building doesn't continue to have the value of the investment that was put into it. But right now, what we see is that it's the same as in the residential market. There's really very little difference between efficient buildings and what they can get in rent or sales prices, and inefficient buildings, even though most of our leases are what you call a triple net. So the tenant of that building pays for the lease, they pay for the energy bills, and they pay the taxes. So they have an incentive to find an efficient building, but the economy isn't working that way right now. And so we think maybe disclosure policy will help bring that to the forefront. So if people are disclosing energy use of buildings publicly when they go to lease them, that might help change that and get people to think of a life cycle goal. We've also have a policy or a program that we've instituted that allows businesses to finance energy improvements, and that financing rides with the building, and it's paid with their property taxes. So it's a program that allows them to pay a bill once a year or quarterly if they want, but it goes with the building. So if the business folds or moves and finds a new space, that debt follows the building instead of the business. And so that hasn't been taken advantage of yet, but we're trying to educate folks and get them to understand. I think those are all good tools to lowering this. I would love to see commercial energy get down 50%. Just noted that would get it to an EUI, an average EUI of 70 in the county if we cut our energy use by 50%. It would get us just below what an average is in the country, but not yet quite to what a energy code compliant building is. So those are
All right, then you like our 50. Perfect.
I like it. It's impressive, but I like it.
So I hear you though, James. I hear you, James. Those so many variables. Of course, we know from Reagan second term, Bush's second term, and who knows about Trump's, that local activism and environmental giving skyrocketed after those victories by those not so environmental presidents.
Sure.
Love to see commercial energy efficiency reach 50%. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. So just a little bit more discussion on the residential energy, and you guys touched on it. There's a housing crisis here, right? And part of the problem is it's expensive to build. Building any new residential spaces costs so much that to lease those spaces and be able to pay your debts, your lease rates are higher than what's affordable for our average income. So we have this disparity between our income and our cost to build and live. And every time the county or any of the towns talks about making our energy code more stringent, what we hear from builders, and they're right, they say, well, you guys want us to build affordable homes, but then you keep making it more expensive for us to build homes. And they're not wrong with that. So we do have to consider the balance between what the tenants of the people living in that home will save in energy and what added cost there is. And so we actually do analysis of that. And there's resources we have from our national labs. Again, the Argonne National Lab does a lot of research of energy codes. They actually build test buildings, and they monitor the energy use, and they quantify what the extra cost was to build that. And they don't just build the one and say that's it. They do a lot of research of the market to understand what that incremental cost is. And so we really try to keep in mind that we don't want to push so far. There's been a lot of people calling for us to have a net zero building code. Like, we can't build any more buildings unless they're net zero. And unfortunately, what we're fearful of, and I think it's a legitimate fear, is that cost to build a net zero building will exceed the savings that the tenants will realize, and we could exacerbate our housing crisis, at least in the short and midterm. Over a long period of time, that might balance out, but it's a real there's conflicts there that are not real easy to unpack. And then, John mentioned, or Tristan, maybe both of you mentioned our undocumented population, and they get taken advantage of in huge ways, where they live in homes that don't have basic services a lot, and they don't feel comfortable reporting that to people in authority, to the government that can do something about that. We actually have basic standards that homes have to meet, and we can condemn a home. We can tell the landlord, you can't rent that home until this is fixed, but we don't hear about it often because people are too vulnerable to come forward. They're being taken advantage of.
Students have a little bit of voice because our president, Salisbury, signed on to a DACA support statement. So the Western's a resource there. But yeah, you're right. In the county, actually, I was talking with one of my former students as a lawyer, and he said he's seen clients, he's seen ICE show up in the courthouse when people go in for, speeding tickets, and he's seen people taken from the valley in that way. And so there is a lot of fear about, complaining about a landlord or any of that renters' rights stuff.
Yeah, it's real, and it's a big problem. So we do have programs. There's a program in the valley called GV Heat, Gunnison Valley Home Energy Assessment Program, or team. Lorna Honan was most recently running that. I think they've now hired a new director. I don't know who it is right now. I should know. But that was a program that really tried to take the place of a former program that was called the Office of Resource Efficiency. And when the Office of Resource Efficiency kind of wasn't moving in that area as much, one of our county commissioners, John Mesner, and I wanted to fill that gap. So we worked with the Housing Authority to stand up GV heat, and we have funding so that what they can do is go into homes and do retrofits. They can add weather sealing, they can insulate, they can replace furnaces. And if people are low income, they can do that at no cost to the people living there. And renters qualify too. If a renter if their income is low, even if their landlords, the person that owns the home has a high income, as long as the person living in the home qualifies and the landlord consents, we can go make improvements. So we're trying to break what they call the split incentive. And I think somebody in one of the groups, I think the energy group, maybe James, brought that split incentive up. And what that is a landlord, if they're not paying the utilities, but they're asking the tenant to pay the utilities, they have no incentive to make the place more energy efficient. The tenant does, but they can't improve a home they don't own. So there's this split incentive, and we have some opportunities to break that by not burdening the landlord with cost, but just still getting the work done with their consent, as long as the tenants qualify. So there's tools to increase building efficiency out there and try to deal with equity. Those tools are pretty rare. They happen in some communities, but when we started looking for models, when we were trying to set up GV heat, we didn't find, there's lots of models for low income housing assistance, but we never found those tied into a housing authority where we were linking low income renters and owners to the resources to help them with their energy cost burden. And so it's been working pretty well. We need to grow that. We need to get more funding. And there's some ideas there too. There's a program that Aspen has had for a long time where if somebody wants to build a home over a certain size, or have a hot tub, or heat the driveway so they don't have to shovel it, they can pay a fee to basically, I call it a fee to pollute. That's not necessarily how they like it framed, but that fee then goes into a fund that helps lower income people build renewable energy, increase the efficiency of their homes, things like that. It's a model that we've been tossing around here, but we want to try to fix it. We don't want to give rich people a free pass. People who have the resources to just pay to pollute shouldn't get to just have a free pass. So, it's a model, but we want to fix it and make it a little more equitable. And we'd love to see that funding directed toward GV heat and going toward low income folks. So transportation group, you guys are up.
Okay. So we have a presentation that is entirely inclusive and radically democratic, in that we have no spokesperson nor plan. So I'm wondering, in that spirit, can you just unmute everyone? Is that crazy? Is that possible? And the reason I think I say that is that of all the groups, I think ours is the most dispersed problem, and most directly connected to this essential fundamental value in the United States, private property, and if we value anything, it's our cars and our SUVs. And so it kind of makes all of us experts. Do you ride the bus? Do you drive a car? Why or why not? We're all conscious participants in that aspect of our lives. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to our group. Anyone who wants to speak. Dave, does that work?
Yeah, they can all unmute and you can all talk.
Okay. And I will just say one thing before I turn it over, and that is, I think we looked at a number of different angles, but two fundamental aspects that concerned us were kind of technical solutions and more cultural solutions, and both seem to be important and intertwined. but that was a way in which we kind of moved our discussion forward. So let me turn it over to all the members of our group, and here's your chance to get your 2 cents in, guys.
I guess a major distinction with transportation is that it does link pretty heavily into jobs and housing availability. Obviously, we all agree about the housing issue in Gunnison, Crested Butte right now. But it was presented earlier that our population's only gone up by 4%, but local transportation has gone up by more than 18. And it was mentioned by John that, a lot of this could have something to do with the lack of housing that's available in Crested Butte, or affordable housing or pet-friendly housing. So a lot of people that work in Crested Butte or their lives are in Crested Butte have to find rental housing down in Gunnison. So that's increased cars on the road because of our lack of availability for housing. Another thing that a lot of our group members discussed were, like the cultural divide of riding the bus, and maybe we need to work on some sort of public education outreach to destigmatize riding the bus. And then also, we threw out a few other ideas, like potentially charging for parking up in Crested Butte, though we worried about how that is not, it makes it more exclusive to be able to get to Crested Butte, even though the bus would be free to get up there, but it would maybe discourage people from driving. Additionally, personally, I think that if the RTA was more pet friendly, like a lot of people, myself included, would take the bus every day instead of driving their own cars.
Thank you, Trudy. Others in the group who would like to report?
Yeah, I'll go. The other thing that I guess I talked about in the group was Gunnison right now doesn't have any emission standards for its vehicles. A lot of other counties in Colorado do. And something like that, creating emission standards might be a good way and a practical way. That does kind of leave some people out because cars with good emissions generally cost more money. So maybe some sort of system where you allow cars that are already on the road, maybe those ones, and then you kind of transition over with a certain amount of time. But something like that, maybe.
I think Shane raises a significant question. In a number of cases, we thought about fees, which would encourage people to do the right thing or discourage them from doing the wrong thing, whether that's parking fees in Crested Butte downtown, maybe on campus at Western, or emission standards, but that also those costs fall more heavily on people without those resources. And so a lot of equity issues came up as we were discussing possible solutions. Others in the group?
One thing that's interesting in Gunnison, and I don't have a graph or a slide for this, but I have the data somewhere. We actually have, both in Crested Butte and Gunnison, we have more bike riders, far more bike riders than average. And so in a lot of communities, they get this mass transit thing solved. They think they have the connectivity, but they have a last mile problem. So once people are off the bus, how do they get that last mile to their destination? And at least anecdotally, it looks like that's not as huge big of a problem here. People are pretty comfortable riding bikes. You could have a bike, sitting at the four-way in Crested Butte waiting for you, and you hop on that and ride the few blocks if you wanted to. That happens. People actually do that. So what do you think? Do you think there's something else stopping? Trudy mentioned pet friendly on the RTA. Is there something else stopping people from using mass transit in large numbers?
It's in the comment, no?
I didn't look there.
We have Tristan talking about COVID a little bit.
Yeah, with COVID, the buses have a vastly reduced occupancy. That's a big problem.
I was wondering also, someone mentioned this in our group. Now I've forgotten exactly what I was going to say. Someone go ahead and I'll think of it.
Something that I was thinking about and that I brought up to the group was the fact that the RTA transit system, although they're on the side of the bus, it says powered by renewable energy. That's all offsets, and it's not like the buses are actually biodiesel themselves. So then you get into the issue of where the emissions are actually coming from. And yes, that's great that we're in an incentive and offset program, but it means that the emissions are still coming from the buses themselves. So I think that's something to account for when you're talking about what the actual the emissions from transportation are. While the buses definitely do allow for a really dramatic decrease in automotive emissions, they still themselves are an issue.
Yeah, the bus emissions is something that is real. I worked. That was one of my first environmental themed projects I worked at here at the county. Was getting our fleet to some sort of an alternative fuel. So that was what was the goal that was set by our commissioners. They said we want to research or transition to an alternative fuel for our buses and our heavy fleet. And we did a lot of research, and I actually worked with Dr. Chavez, and we did some what we call wheels to wells emissions studies. So we looked at the whole from the time that a fuel source is generated and the emissions associated with that all the way out to the end use. And at least at the time, we found that electric buses would actually emit more carbon to the atmosphere than our current diesel fleet. And that we didn't see a lot of change in the future from our utilities. We started this work in 2013. And so we were informed by about a 10-year cycle, vehicle replacement cycle. And that's what framed kind of our decision making and which ones we went with. And we started looking at different options, and we ended up with natural gas as the lowest carbon currently, and would continue to be the lowest carbon emitter in that 10-year period that we were framing this in. And then after that, we were hopeful that electricity would clean up enough where there could be a transition to electric buses at that time. But we would have started a culture of transitioning and changing our fleet type to follow a low emission standard. That was a controversial decision to go with CNG. There's people that disagreed strongly with us, and I totally understand those positions, and we tried to defend those with the findings that Abel and we had some work with researchers at NREL and also Argonne and the Colorado Energy Office. And so as we did that, we actually we found out that there's renewable gas that was it wasn't purchased. It was just being put into the grid, and nobody was buying it at the time. So we purchased enough of that to offset the use for the vehicles we knew we could buy at that time, which was our RTA fleet. And we were still working on transition to other fleets. And so those fleets are fueled by gas that's made from, landfill gas that's captured, or, pig farms that are taking the waste and digesting it to make methane. And then that gas gets put in the grid, and we were buying it. Since then, there's been a huge market for that. And And that, a lot of that has to do with California's zero emission vehicle standard actually incentivizes the sale of renewable gas and created a marketplace that's making that very valuable. So we were lucky to get in on some of that. You know, where we go from there, we're about 3 or 4 years into this 10-year vehicle replacement cycle. But right now, that's what our buses are running on. And we cut the emissions by about 30% by going to CNG, and then another, and then more from that if you take into account the renewable gas. But it is a credit system, as you brought up, where gas is going in somewhere and we're taking credit for it here. So anytime those credit systems, whether it's solar or gas, you know, you got to ask how that works. And is it greenwashing? I don't feel like this one's greenwashing because it's a commodity. It's a physical commodity that you can measure. Electricity is a lot harder to trade that way because it's instantaneous. It's not storable. You can store natural gas in a pipeline under pressure. So anyway, that's kind of a side note, but when we're talking about
I do like that distinction, because our students talk a lot about greenwashing, and the distinction of if it's measurable is interesting.
Yeah. It's a very difficult thing to pick apart when people make claims. There's a lot of claims from industry of 100% renewable, but where are they how are they substantiating that claim? And a lot of times they're substantiating it by buying credits from, you know, most often it's wind, right? And wind that's getting built because it's the cheapest way to generate energy, but the people in that area don't care about the environmental benefits, so they sell what they call the environmental credits, the environmental attributes, off to people who do. So they kind of get like two revenue streams. They made a decision to build that resource because it was the smart thing to do, is the right generation source, and then they get to go sell the credit for that to other communities. So it's kind of like double counting almost. There's a lot of rules when you're accounting for carbon to avoid double counting, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen in like a passive sense. You know, people who live in a community under windmills, and they say that's our power source, and they don't know that their utility sold the credit for that to someone else. It's a weird like pseudo accounting like economic system that's arisen around that stuff.
John, could I add one point that I think makes Gunnison County unusual and presents different challenges than many places around the United States, is the high percentage of recreationists, and public transportation tends not to take us to the places we want to fish or to the trailheads we want to hike from. And I think for many people, it kind of rules out not having a vehicle that you own, because otherwise you can't do what's so important for many of us to do. If you live in a city, you know, the vast majority of your trips are to places that you can access through public transportation. Gunnison is really hard that way. And I don't know, that's a hard nut to crack.
It's very hard. That's a great point. I mean, I think a lot of us drive vehicles for the weekend, right? The vehicle I drive is maybe not the best vehicle to drive day in and day out, but I drive that vehicle for what I want to do on the weekend. And I think a lot of us share that. And so as we're talking about this, though, that's an efficiency side of the vehicles. And there's some opportunities. Aspen's got a really interesting program where they're trying to decouple those things and create an economy where you don't own a vehicle, but you can easily get whatever kind of vehicle you want. You can ride share, you can rent a vehicle, you could go rent yourself an SUV to go to the trailhead, and they're easy to get. And there's I think some interesting lessons they're learning with that program, and it's totally about trying to understand how that economy will work. And I'm sure, I don't know if Ashley Pearl talked about that. I missed her talk, but it's really interesting program that I think could help inform us. But what we've really focused on in this model is miles traveled instead of efficiency. And efficiency is incredibly important. We don't have a lot of control over that as a local government, but we might have some control over how many miles are traveled. And we do that through our land use, primarily, our land use policies. And so things like making sure that we are aligning our land use policies and our zoning to connect housing near the jobs that that'll support that level of housing, right? So the affordable housing that's getting built, in Crested Butte costs like $400,000 for a home. You don't do that working at PETA's up there, right? So they understand there's a struggle there. Like how do they actually get housing that a dishwasher can afford or a lifty? That's a really big challenge, but that'll start to connect people to their jobs in a way where we don't, where we're not having to drive so far. So land use is a really big piece. We think there's been some discussion in the STORE. So STORE is a group of local land agencies and trails advocacy groups that's trying to align all our work together that the county hosts. And we've talked a lot about trailheads and connectivity of trailheads to population centers. So we want to make sure that people, it's easy if you're going to ride a bike, that you don't feel like you have to drive to a trailhead to get on your bike and ride a loop, but that everything that when we plan our new trails, that everything is connected to population centers. The county just recently did a deal to get 76 homes or housing units built. Some of them will be apartments in the north end of Gunnison. And it was really important to us that we got a trail easement actually from Western to make sure that we could connect that housing to the Signal Peak trail system. And that was with Western, that was an easy deal that Western's totally on board with that. But that's important to us because we know that people that live in Gunnison are recreationalists and we don't want them to drive to recreate. We want them to go from their door. So there's a lot of ties to, I think, land use and housing, to jobs and to recreation. Recreation's a harder nut to crack, but I think let's think about some other things that have happened recently. There's been camping getting closed in most of the drainages, dispersed camping in most of the drainages in the north end of the valley. And that's because cars are going up there, they're pulling right off the side of the road, they're setting up a camp, right? Is it hard to imagine a situation where we go one step further and we say, there's no more cars driving up and down those corridors. Instead, you have to get on a tour bus, or there's vans that take people to the trailheads they want to go hike up by Marble, or up, if you want to ride 401 and you don't want to ride the loop, you have to get a shuttle. I think those things I think might start changing behavior and reducing just like recreational driving, where you're just driving, like every fall, all the Denver news talks about when's a good time to go see the leaves. And that's like a passive recreational driving, right? You drive hundreds of miles to go look at leaves and you stay in your car all day. I think there's other ways to get the same experience that we might be able to.
We picked on Belarus last night and now it's aspen leaves.
Right.
But let's shift to waste.
Yeah, so let's before we shift, I know we're running out of time talking too much. What do we think is a reasonable reduction in miles VMT, vehicle miles traveled? Did you guys come up with a number, or do you need a little help with that?
We said 20 to 30 because we're pessimists.
20 to 30 is huge. But okay, let's go with 20. So just for context, the city of Denver has a 20-year goal of reducing vehicle miles traveled by like 10%. It's an incredibly hard thing to influence. But let's go with this. That's amazing, and it makes a huge difference in our forecast. I'm going to share our screen again here so you guys can see where we're at with that, and then we'll move on to waste. As you can see, I put in, I'll go back to 0. We were just under 40%. If we cut our vehicle miles traveled by 20%, we're at, nearing 50% reduction in our emissions. So that's huge. At our conference this winter, the groups came up with, I think it was 8%. And what that was like, if everybody took 2 days off a month from driving, when they would normally drive, you could get to like 8%. So that was their logic there. But okay, let's go to landfill waste. And I'll stop sharing so we can see each other.
Hi, everybody. I'll go ahead and take the lead. We also did not have a plan for who was speaking. So if nobody has any objections, I'll just go for it. Great. Our group discussed really right out of the gate what waste meant to not only Gunnison County, but to anybody living outside of Gunnison County. And we kind of came up with a few categories. So there's human solid waste, organics or like compostable waste. And then we talked a little bit about recycling as well. And we came up with a 50% reduction in waste, just based upon initially the fact that about 30% of what Gunnison throws into the landfill, at least of 2018, is considered compostable. And so we thought it would be reasonable to reduce that by half in 10 years. So that's about where we were at. Some strategies, we had some really interesting strategies on how to reduce that waste. And one topic of waste that was brought up that we didn't really get a chance to dive into, but I thought was interesting because we started right off the bat with it, was somebody mentioned light pollution as well as a type of human waste. And I thought that was interesting. So something to chew on for you all. Nani Richardson mentioned in one of her projects for, I don't think it was a capstone level class, but they analyzed the recycling crisis in Colorado right now. And there's a $30,000 piece of equipment that would allow Gunnison County to recycle number 5 plastic, which could contribute to a huge reduction in just recycling waste. Of course, we talked about having a community scale composting program to reduce that organic waste. So a couple of different solutions provided there, but I'll keep it short and sweet since we're running out of time. If anybody would like to add anything else for my group, absolutely feel free.
I like that you guys took a broader view of waste. I think it's really important to understand like all of humans' impact, but when it comes to like landfill waste, it's a huge problem. We're lucky here. We have lots of land and not many people. So we're not like running out of space, but it's still, it's an enormous problem that we can't just ignore. The county, this area, we actually have far above the rest of the state, recycling rates that are far above the rest of the state. We're doing pretty good, but that's with a really inefficient system if you think about it. For most people, you have to actually pack up your own recyclables and drive them out to the recycle center and separate them. The fact that we are above average in the state and we have that inefficient of a system is really remarkable. It means our people are really engaged with this and they care a lot about recycling. So, I think that's, I really am impressed with that because I compare that to other places where you can have commingled recycling that have lower rates than us, where they have drop-offs that are ubiquitous. You could go 4 blocks and have a drop-off. We have to drive across town and out south of Gunnison to go drop off our recycling, and yet people do it, and a lot of people do it. So that's a really good thing. It says a lot about people who live in this place and where their values are. Organic waste it's a opportunity as well as a problem we have to deal with. The opportunity for the county is extending our landfill's life cycle. If we could take, if organic waste is 30% of that waste stream, and we could take that out of the waste stream, we vastly increase the life and the utility of the investment we put into building that cell. A landfill cell might just seem like a hole in the ground, but it's actually a really expensive thing to build. The county has millions of dollars invested into the cell that we're using now, and we'll have an ongoing obligation to monitoring and making sure that that's not causing any problems with water quality downstream or anything forever, virtually. So it's a really important thing that we get our heads around, but it's a difficult, I know a lot of you have looked into this, and Western's been really engaged in trying to help provide research and data and help untangle this problem for local governments. And every time we learn something, it gets more complex, and we learn about further challenges that we maybe hadn't anticipated. But I think that this is something that'll happen in the near future. I just heard last week that Vail actually has a contract with a composter in Montrose County, and they're going to be shipping all of their compostables down there to be composted. And that's a long way, but at least they're doing something. At least, you know, they started. Matt Fire was their the director down there of environmental sustainability for a long time, and he got them to move to compostable single uses. For all their single use stuff, they transitioned to compostable products, and they were trying to compost on site. They did a fairly good job of that, but it was more than they could handle on site. So now they've taken that next step. And so organizationally, that's sometimes how things work. It's these baby steps. You first start changing habits and your uses, and then you move on to actually moving to the end goal. And they've done, they're a ways down that road. What that means for the rest of us is that now there's a market that's already developed a waste stream that could go in to support a compost facility in this valley. And they've already developed that. They've figured out how to separate their waste. They've got that down. They've got the right kind of compostable materials, and now they're just looking for a place to bring it, to sell it, to market. So it's a huge step, and I think it just predicts that sooner or later we're going to have something local and not be shipping it out, because that's, you know, developing that market is probably the hardest part. So I'm going to quick share my screen and wrap it up.
Drum roll.
Yeah, so I think we're below 50% here. It looks like that's 40% and there's 60%. Looks like we got below 50% for our forecasted greenhouse gases. So, you know, that's where we need to be in 10 years. And that's an incredible change. And I think it's going to take a lot of work to actually see that happen. But we know there's a path to this. And that's the first step, is really just kind of overcoming that, that being stuck in the status quo, and understanding that there's a way to change, and that path is realistic, and breaking it down into things that are real. So we broke this down piece by piece, and we came up with the ambitious goal, but goals that are achievable. Some of the goals that you guys
said, I think optimistic. I think let's go further. And so the fact that it's still just is doable. See that?
John, your audio is failing.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what to do. Can you hear me okay?
Better now.
That's better.
Sounds good now.
I will talk slow, but finish quickly. For what I was saying was, I hope that this gives people hope that what we need to do is achievable. The goals you set were, in some cases, I think a little pessimistic. I think we could go further with electric decarbonization. Some of them were ambitious. I think building efficiency for commercial, I'd love to see us cut 50%. That might not be achievable, but all in all, these are achievable goals, and I hope that it gives you hope that we can do this. And almost every one of these things, not because I tried to make a theme around inclusivity and equity, but because it's just part of the process, there is always an equity angle to these. I don't think you can address global warming without at the same time fixing the inequities in our economy. And that's because as long as we have inequities, it's too easy to hide our emissions and hide the impacts of our lifestyles and put them off on other people who are displaced or don't have a voice. We can't continue to, pollute the deserts with all our coal-fired generation out there where we don't see it, and just go on as normal and not think about where our energy is coming from. And we can't continue to, keep adding waste everywhere and just filling more and more land with that. We need to deal with it. And we cannot continue to have some people living in housing that is vastly inferior to the average. To fix global warming, we have to fix that, and we'll improve the quality of life for those people that are in those types of situations. So this is totally integrated with social issues, and environmental issues cannot be really untied. And thanks for all your time. Thanks for engaging in this. And I appreciate, you all and all the thoughts you had. I was really impressed with the group I got to sit and listen to. I'm sure they were all very good. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Let's all unmute and use our chat and thank John so much. Fountain of wisdom comes to mind as a phrase. That was really a clinic, John. I'm excited about how hopeful it was and how just organically integrated it is with the social inequity conversation. And I think that also gives me hope, is that these intersections are revealing themselves, right, rather than having to force it. So thank you. Students, I want you to kind of finish our conference here. Students and participants and community members and audience members and faculty. Usually we have a thing called the Talking Gourd ceremony, where Art Good Times on Sunday morning has a gourd, an actual gourd that's been part of Headwaters now for 31 years, and you pass it around when it's your turn. You say your piece of what the conference has left you with, and sometimes people even play a song or read a reading that they love, or just share something from the heart from the conference. We're not going to do that today. We're going to do a COVID Zoom era version of it, though. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is just kind of take a minute. You can close your eyes if you want. Think about, one word, like word association. I'm going to go through the conference briefly, and just in your head, you're going to play word association. Okay, so like, Art Good Times opened with The Art of Getting Lost. Alan Wartez shared a tale through song about how hard it is to adapt to a place like this, with how amazing the place is. Winona LaDuke shared a vision for pandemics as portals and empowered you with a set of choices from people who are traditionally disempowered, who are finding agency for sustainable food and energy. Right? You got up in the morning and Ashley Pearl shared with you a kind of 101 basics version of what goes into climate action planning. And we shifted to Michael Mendez, right, who's world renowned for understanding how to bring social justice actions into that process. You all went out and contemplated an action that's a missed opportunity and that inspires you. You came back and heard from Aaron Abeda, a heartfelt letter from a mayor and poet. And then you went through this process with your county sustainability director, who shared everything he had. I've been watching the NBA, he left it all on the court. So you could really understand, like, no more of this vague, like, why doesn't the US meet the UN goal of carbon neutrality? But you know what it looks like a little bit now, like, oh, okay, you got to break it down in terms of these different categories of waste and energy and building and transportation. And when you do that, you're breaking down within those categories. And what seemed possible might actually be a pipe dream. And what's concerning you might actually be possible. And through that process, he showed you how you can get to close to 50% reductions by 2030, when you all took a pretty conservative approach. And he's a very pragmatic leader. And so, just thinking about that and what the conference has given you, right? Whether it's something about the sacred that LaDuke shared, or about action that Mendez shared, or about the technicalities of getting this done that John shared, why don't you each just type what you think the most desirable and accessible climate action is for you as you leave this conference, a next step for you, available, accessible, desirable climate action for you. Just type that into the chat. I think the faculty and John and I will enjoy seeing that. And after you've read each other's, you go enjoy yourselves. I would recommend typing into YouTube, Cold Harbor Institute Harvest Dinner. That starts at 4. And if you want to get involved in 350 acres of land that your program's involved in for experimenting with this kind of stuff, you can enjoy that celebration. But if you want it to end now, that's fine as well. You've given us a lot this weekend. So again, available, accessible, desirable climate action. That's your next step after this conference. Just type it in.